Well, good afternoon. Great to see everyone. I know it's just after lunch. Sorry, there's a bit of feedback here. Better. I know it's just after lunch, but really appreciate you taking time out to join our session today. It's a keynote session on the healthcare and senior living space, and I'm absolutely delighted to have a stellar panel of experts here that have literally come from all over the place, including Europe, to be with us today. Ron van Bloois at the end there, who's the chair and co-founder of the Senior Housing and Healthcare Association, all the way from the Netherlands this morning. So thank you, Ron, for coming. Phillipa Kellar, who's been with Bupa for many years, later living director, but Phillipa, you have other hats that you wear as well, which I'm sure you'll explain in a little bit. Beirne, from Octopus Capital, who heads up retirement living. Nick Sanderson, CEO of Audley, but Nick also has other hats with ARCO, one of the main trade bodies for the senior housing sector in the UK. And Omair Haider of Millennium Care Group, a really interesting regional provider that have gone from care homes into senior living and now bringing intergenerational concepts into those schemes as well. Now, I should say this is the first part of a double bill. So for those of you that are registered, we're actually hosting a fringe event directly after this panel, going to the Audley Scarcroft scheme, fabulous facility, not far from here on the outskirts of Leeds. So if you are going to that, please just sort of wait outside the back door there, and we'll sort of head over to the bus together. If you've got colleagues that will be interested in joining, we do have a few spare spaces, so please also go there. There's some big boots on the buses. I'm sure we can squeeze everyone in. So without further ado then, I'd like to sort of start by doing a little bit of a scene set. And Phillipa, I'll come to you first, if I may. With the UK's population over 80 years set to double in the next 20 years, we're at that purple patch in the market. The baby boomers are sort of here and are aging. The NHS is under more pressure than ever. It'll be great to get your view as to where you think the country is in terms of appropriate housing, senior living housing, and care home provision for that market. Where are we, and where do we need to get to?
Thank you. As you just said, so I work for Bupa. I've worked for Bupa for 16 years. I used to run one of their hospitals, and then I've been working as the MD for Richmond Villages for the last 8 years, and then I've been doing a piece of work about later living. Because, as you said, as we know, it is an ageing population. We know we don't have appropriate housing for people. And I think, from my point of view as well, there's a whole conversation that needs to change in the UK, that we need to be much more about prevention, keeping people as independent as we can for as long as we can. And I think we need to have a whole conversation about like smart multi-generational neighbourhoods, how we do the planning for it. I think IRC, so independent retirement, integrated retirement communities, which a number of us are involved in, is still a very nascent market in the UK. We know we're not building enough homes to house people appropriately. The task force indicated that we should be building between 30 and 50,000 a year, and we're only building 7,000. So there's a real problem here with an ageing demographic. I think it's really important that we give people lots of different options. Some people will want to be able, to stay in their own home. That's absolutely fine, but we need to be able to support them correctly to do that. But we also need to have other options, such as integrated retirement communities. Within Richmond Villages, we do a whole continuum of care. So we do everything from independent living, assisted living, where we give people additional support, all the way to care homes on site. We think that works well for us. I know for Nick and Audley, there's different versions, but I think it's how we all work together to be able to deliver what's a growing need, and it's only going to get increasingly demanding. We've done a lot about how do we support people in our villages in terms of living well, whether that's additional services, virtual GP, all of those sort of things that we can offer as being part of Bupa. And we need to be able to look at doing that because people will not be able to travel necessarily to where services are. There's the whole 10-year plan for the NHS. It's actually about how do you support people where they are living. And at the moment, we're not doing it to the scale that we need to. And we need to really have a discussion about how we work together to build more suitable housing and support people in their own homes.
Well, lots of themes covered there. Nick, obviously you've been in the sector for a long time as well, and a figurehead with ARCO as well as your own business with Audley. Fascinated to get your perspective as well on the same topic, and maybe also a bit of an overview of your time and your journey in the sector and how you've seen it sort of go from where it started to where it is now.
Yeah, thank you, Mike. It's been it's been quite a long journey and quite an interesting one, and I'm still staggered that I'm sitting in front of you now where we're talking about it as a nascent sector. I was with some Canadians last week, Chartwell. They've got, I think, 35,000 units across the whole of Canada. They are the biggest house builder in Canada. Ryman in New Zealand are the biggest house builder in New Zealand. They were the 4th largest listed business in New Zealand until recently, bigger than Air New Zealand. And yet we still sit here and talk about it as a sector that needs development. And as Philip has absolutely rightly said, the task force came out with the number of what could be done, but truthfully it could be bigger. And we're sitting here with a relatively modest-sized audience. There are others sitting in areas talking about student housing or build-to-rent or other categories who will be full to the rafters with people looking to get into it. And yet there are 12 million older people with £3 trillion worth of housing wealth who are very, very poorly served. And going to the particular point, Mike, about the benefits that brings, and the NHS actually is one, we've also got a massive deficit as a country from funding an unsustainable cost of health and social care in this country, which is going to get worse and worse and worse as the population age. And if you went to Jimmy's in Leeds or the infirmary today, you'll see an A&E department stacked full of older people who are there because they were living in inappropriate housing, had a fall, and ended up with no choice but to go into hospital and ending up in a care home. So this is huge, and it's potentially much larger than most other categories that are being discussed here today, and we have a very, very long way to go, Mike. And I suppose I'm the one to blame, really, because I've been doing it longer than most. So.
Excellent. So coming to you, Omair. So you've sort of come at this from a slightly different perspective, starting off in care homes and evolving. What's your assessment of where we are as a country now, and your own journey as well will be useful to hear.
Thank you, Mike. The World Health Organization recognises the UK as being one of the most age-segregated countries in Europe. And in response to that, it sees that age segregation is one of the biggest challenges to social cohesion in the future. And as a consequence of that, we're seeing the urbanisation of cities, which is heavily populated by young people, as older people are being moved out into more suburban and more rural areas. As a consequence of that, we're seeing a real demographic shift and a generational divide where there's a big wedge between the young and old alike. And I remember reading a statistic that in the 1990s, 15% of young people lived with an elderly person on their street as part of the approach to going to school and playing in the neighbourhood and going to the park. Mixing with an elderly neighbour was part of their day-to-day life and living, and they'd have that exposure to elderly people. Fast forward to today, that figure is less than 5%. What is that doing to a generational divide where there's a clear and potential misunderstanding of the young and old alike not mixing but understanding each other's needs? That then, I guess, that age divide could potentially harness the impact of loneliness, specifically for people in care homes who are only really mixing with other elderly people with comorbidities and health problems. And I guess our passion and interest is how are we overcoming that by integrating co-located nurseries where care homes operate.
Fantastic. Ron, I'd love to get an international perspective.
Yeah, that's fine.
You may not need a microphone. There's another one, actually. We'll pass that one down. There we go.
No, it was a suggestion to hold your microphone a little bit more in your mouth.
There we go.
No, great. All the way from Europe. That was I thought that was a forbidden joke that I'm all the way from Europe. No, I want to have you back in Europe. So please, that's why I'm here. Well, in principle, it's a global issue. I co-founded the Senior Housing and Healthcare Association 6 years ago. We had 4 members: Aidivika, Klagian, a lawyer, and I think 1 German developer. And now we have 70 members with a global reach. And we do struggle with the same issues. So actually, I don't want to talk about demographics because for me, that's a no-brainer. But I think the big issue is in the financing system. Because in principle, it's indeed, to my opinion, one of the most impactful asset classes. And so I fully agree with Nick. It's, from ESG point of view, most impactful. For society, it's the most impactful. And also with the baby boomers, we have a huge tsunami where it's also an opportunity. So it's how you look at the framing of aging. And therefore, I'm actually very positive. But indeed, I'm for 20 years in this business. And it's, of course, crazy that we still need to explain this in a real estate fair. And so we are always at MIPIM, always at Expo Real. But I think it's moving, and also especially when people are experiencing itself. So when it's about your mother, your father, when it's about yourself, then it changes. Think about the energy crisis. I'm obsessed by 2 items, healthcare and sustainability. And when people need to pay triple the price because Putin was shutting off the gas, then people were buying solar panels. And that's also, I think, related to healthcare. So if the knife is on your throat, then we will change. And that's why also prevention is so difficult, because indeed we need to find a solution for the hockey stick. It's actually very simple. The spendings of healthcare is in the last 6 months of your life. It's doing like that, whop. So we need to find a solution how we minimize the hockey stick effect and how we are more collaborative, how we also try to make also a different cultural mindset about aging. Can we live with somebody with dementia next to you? We should, let's say, get rid of the idea that when you have dementia that you need to go to a care home. Well, maybe in the end, but then it's more a hospice. In principle, when you're having light dementia, you need to stay at home or in an appropriate facility. So it's mindset, it's also how real estate is collaborating, and it's also especially how we fund the system. It's very silo funding, and we need to fund the society, and that's the biggest challenge.
Fantastic. Kevin, bringing you in, you're Octopus, an investor that covers both care homes and obviously the area that you're focused in, which is the retirement living space. Where do you, with sort of both of those perspectives, where do you think we are as a country, and what excites you also as an investor looking ahead?
Yeah, I think the word is simple, and that's underserved in both of those areas. So whether you're looking at in the care home space, yeah, the data is pretty strong against the demographics we have, and it's highly predictable. Unfortunately, we pretty much, with some accuracy, know where population is going, so we know more or less accurately who will have what conditions in what geographies over the next 10, 20 years. Do we have enough care homes to serve that need? No. And a lot of what we do have is outdated, what we call mom and pop type operations, converted properties, but not really fit for modern healthcare. Excuse me, I've got a bit of a sore throat. I had a slight cold, but more down to supporting Arsenal last night, so I'll just could not get that one.
I thought I saw you about 2 a.m. somewhere, Kevin.
Yeah,
so.
Someone had to do it, didn't they? Philip is also an Arsenal fan, by the way, as well, so happy to answer questions on that as well. In the second space, I tend to think about this in a very kind of macro way. And when we think about healthcare in the UK, what's the first thing we think about? It's obvious, isn't it? We think about the good old NHS, Auntie NHS. Actually, that's not the start of the story. When did health outcomes start to fundamentally change in the United Kingdom? It was 50 or 60 years before the creation of the NHS. Why did they start to change? Well, a lot of the morbidity was related to poor housing. So what happened? We had public health become involved in the worst housing. We had slum clearance, we had high quality public housing built. And funnily enough, the health of the nation changed fundamentally, particularly after the First World War, well in advance of the creation of the NHS. Now just take that thinking for a second and apply it to demographics. In the UK and pretty much everywhere across Europe, Ron, we know that in the next 10 years, between 25 and 30% of our population are going to be retired, and the main risk to their health is the house that they live in. You know, what's the angle of a staircase in a typical metro land property? Go and try and walk down one when you're 75 or 80 years old, and then wonder why people end up, as Nick said, in A&E. You know, and that's repeated throughout the whole household experience. So actually put those two pieces together, and it is about thinking from a strategic perspective about ageing, and that's that if the house is the biggest challenge, as it was in public health back at the turn of the 19th to 20th century, then surely thinking about where and how people live is fundamental to improving the health outcomes, the experience and the general well-being of that third of our population who happen to be in retirement.
Kevin,
so it's a big macro question.
Would you say, I've read and it's been reported that the shortage of age-appropriate housing is often seen as a real estate opportunity, but I think what we're all saying, it's almost a public health crisis as well, which we need to grasp.
I think uniquely it's both, because interestingly, you know, fortunately in the UK we have healthcare free at the point of use. So whether you live in a £2 million house or a £100,000 house, if you become unwell or you need a hospital service, you're costed on the NHS. So, you know, it's important to think about that. And it does stand out from other public services in that point. So, yeah, it has a very big public sector element to it in terms of, you know, fiscal policy. And you're right, you know, if you look over the last 10, 15 years, our older population has been growing significantly more quickly than the development of new retirement housing. So in real terms, you know, we've lost about 15% of that retirement housing stock over the last 10 or 15 years. So we're going backwards precisely at the time we need to go forwards. But I am an investor, so for me, that's the opportunity. But we need to think about the products, the structures that really answer that question and brings, you know, a product to all different kind of price points of the market that works for that 30%, across that 30% of our population.
I'd like now to focus on operating concepts, because we've got three different operators on the panel here. They have, you know, they're all serving a similar population, but with different types of businesses. Phillipa, if we could start with you in terms of Richmond, just explain to the audience what a typical Richmond development would look like, and also how you're looking to evolve it going forward in terms of areas that you're focusing on.
Yeah, so as I explained, we have what we call like independent living. So people purchase a property, they can get as involved as they like within the community. It's very much up to them. We then have assisted living, which you can either purchase or rent, because we're seeing a growing demand for rental. In those, we'll do services such as your food, your laundry, cleaning, all sorts of different things, but really with the aid of keeping you as independent as possible in your own home. And then we have a CQC registered care home on site as well. The reason for that is because we've learned from our experience in New Zealand. Bupa own 35 retirement villages within New Zealand. And the learning there was very much that continuum of care really supported people. It's not for everyone, but for those people that have, particularly where you have couples where they have different needs, you know, one person may be experiencing a greater demand for services. It's a great way of keeping them together within the village. And then you can support people on that journey, particularly like with dementia. You know, we can keep people in their own homes and part of the villages for longer on that basis. And then when they do need that extra support, they can move to that care home. But then their loved ones is still in the village, and they can see them all the time, etc. So I think it's really important to do that. I think In terms of the learning in New Zealand, I think over 70% have that continuum of care. And I think it's really important. I love the whole stuff about multi-generational. We haven't been brave enough to do a nursery on site, but we're looking at things. We always invite local nurseries in. We're part of the National Literacy Trust and doing work on that. So I think it's we're really focusing now on that prevention side of it. There's so much information about there. We're trying to back like what Ron was saying, change that conversation actually it's about aging well and trying to keep you as fit and well as you can for as long as you can. And we know that we've got an aging population, but we also know that lifespans, have extended, but they're plateauing. But the period of ill health is growing, and that's a real issue. Both society, NHS, everything. So there's so much that you can do, but we're trying to change that conversation rather than having falls reduction. That sounds just terrible, doesn't it? It's like, how do you engage in mobility and strength? I think it's 95% of women over the age of 65 do not have the strength and mobility they're going to need as they grow older. They're the sort of conversations we need to be having, but making it fun and doing things that are really about, how do you improve your strength? And we know people don't want to go to a gym where everybody's 25, so that's why we have gyms on site, so that people can feel really relaxed doing activities that they feel is appropriate for them with the right setting. So we're doing lots more about that. We've introduced a lot more Bupa services, so we're lucky that we can do that. So we offer things such as access to 24/7 nurse line, virtual GP. Although I was telling a panel earlier, we introduced virtual GP, and a load of residents said to me, "Oh, I'm not using that. That's a bot." And then we had to explain, no, actually, it's a video. But there's a lot of things that we have to then change the conversation about how we speak about things, so that we make it relevant to people and they see it's appropriate.
We'll come back on the GP point in a bit, because I think that's an interesting concept. Nick, bringing you in, Audley don't have a care home on site, and that's a common theme with some of the other large providers. And it'd be useful just to explain your model, but also the rationale and the reasoning why you don't have a care home on site, but how you actually support people.
Yeah, it's interesting, funny enough, because I started actually at that end. I actually started developing care homes, which are now part of Barchester. And actually from that, which was a relatively high dependency model, but there were very few housing options available then. So people were coming in for a really quite lengthy period of stay within a care home, and none of them wanted to be there. And that's when we introduced the concept of having housing alongside our care homes, effectively what Phillipa has. We called it close care, and that was the origins of Audley. We then moved away to a much more, as you rightly say, all housing-based model. I was reflecting, actually, when Phillipa was talking, a colleague of all of ours who used to run one of our competitors, who now actually works for the Duchy of Cornwall, said to me one day, he said, "I didn't realise when I joined this sector, my whole job was to keep people out of care homes." Which is what it is, because nobody wants to go. I mean, I don't think anybody here would volunteer to go into a care home, though some of them, which Kevin finances, are brilliant. The point is, it should be, as has been said, our job is to reduce that to as short a period as possible at the end of life, to make it much more a end-of-life hospice-type service to support people through those stages. Now, if you do that, in theory, you will significantly reduce the number of people who live in our communities who need it, to a point where actually we got to a point where we said, well, actually, it isn't sustainable to have a care home fully supported by the community. Therefore, you're bringing in people from outside, I think, which Phillipa would agree. And therefore, let's instead put more emphasis on the independent living piece, more emphasis on the health and wellness, and exactly what Philippa's described, keeping people enabled for as long as possible, which means you should reduce those who need to leave to a very small number. Now, that does give us the disadvantage, which we don't have, which Phillipa doesn't have, which is that you can keep people together on one site. But that, I would suggest, is a relatively small number. And therefore, it's a choice, and it's because one of our deep problems, and anyone who comes to Scarcroft will see it's nothing like a care home, but if you stop people in the street in the village of Scarcroft and said, what is Scarcroft Park? They say, oh, it's a care home. Because they don't know what it is, so they associate it with a care home. So if you're trying to work people away from that. Conceptually, they should be fearful of it. Not having a care home sort of helps. That's all.
Omair, bringing you in then, so a completely different model to, well, so there are similarities, but also differences. You've gone from being a care home operator to retirement living and intergenerational aspect. I'd love the audience to hear about your current scheme, Standish, because you're sort of pushing the boundaries a bit further there. Maybe just explain a little bit about that and what the vision is behind that scheme.
And we're fiercely passionate around how the design of the environment, how does the design of the care home have therapeutic benefits for people with dementia. And there's no medication that exists that allows someone with dementia to live freely and independently in a care home setting without feeling overwhelmed and stressed. And it goes back to the conversation discussion around age-appropriate housing and stopping people from going into care homes. But when someone goes into a care home, how do you stop them from their dementia accelerating? How do you stop them from moving into a hospital environment? How do you stop them from premature deaths and accelerated comorbidities? And from having spent years doing a lot of research and looking at some incredible schemes internationally, including the Netherlands at De Hodges and spending time with Stirling University, there's a stark realization that if you get the design of a care home right, and we subscribe to something called the household model of care, so we take away that sense of institution and the design and the operation of a care home and run it like a house in an open plan kitchen, so people are encouraged to be involved in that household. You see some incredible outcomes. You know, in some of our care home settings, we've got people with dementia that will bake their own cakes in a kitchen where there's no commercial kitchen in the care home. They'll go out to the garden, get their own tomatoes and carrots, peel them, make their own soups. They wouldn't have done that previously in their own home, but they're supported to do that in their environment. Moving that on to kind of another level of intergenerational care, again, there's no medication in the world that exists that gives an elder person the same spark and joy that you get the moment you put a baby in their hands. And I remember a couple of months ago, me and Alex and Ed from Delve Architects, we went to see Nightingale House in London, and they have a co-located nursery as part of their care village, and they run 30 sessions a week where children from the nursery on the site of the care home go in and they're engaged in activities. And there were people in that care home who couldn't speak, they couldn't move, they couldn't communicate. But as soon as the children were in that room doing activities and reading to them, the room was alive. It was incredible to see. And again, no medication can replicate that. And we're really inspired by that. And that kind of drives our purpose around an intergenerational care village, but linking that with deinstitutionalised dementia care practice as well.
And does the presence of the nursery help from a staffing, a workforce recruitment perspective for your business?
Absolutely. So one of the greatest barriers for people in care that are new parents to going back to work is that often they can't manage childcare. They may not have parents, or there may not be a nursery close to where they live. So having that co-located nursery on the site of where they work helps to bring them back into employment sooner and quicker.
So Ron, intergenerational, what do you see across Europe? What can we learn? Microphone. You don't need a microphone.
I could sing a song, but well, I think we only have 1 hour. First of all, I would like to invite you all to the summit, because every year, this year, the 30th of June, we organize a full-day summit about this topic, because we now have 60 minutes, which is, of course, we try to tackle the whole spectrum. When it's about intergenerational, I think where we see a lot of inspiration on the European scale is where do we try to find the solution? You shouldn't try to find the solution on the asset level. And I think when I look at the Netherlands, Germany, Spain also, it's actually also that the municipality is becoming very important stakeholder. So actually, when you take an analysis of a city or a rural area, you need to make policy about how can we have a resilient community as a city or a rural area? And I think that's where the solution is, that it's almost a public-private partnership. And also when we are aware that it's indeed almost a quarter of the population in your city, then it needs a proper design of your city. And when I was flying in this morning, I took the bus, I stepped out, I almost fell because actually the pavements of Leeds is, from a mobility point of view, not appropriate for aging. And it's just a minor example, but when you know that 1 on the 4 persons is 65 years and older, then it needs a proper analysis about what does it take for mobility, does it take for accessibility of a city, or for example, when it's about movement in a city, we need to take it one step further. So indeed, intergenerational, it's also about that we need to have active adults. I think the old system where it was institutionalized, and then you went to a former care home, and actually you were sitting in your own studio or in your living room, and no activation at all. And when I see activation, it's about mental health. So you need to do education, but it's indeed also the gym, where it's not a gym of 25 years old. No, we have a gym where it's fun to sport with 75-year-old people. And I think that's a different mindset. And so it's not a nice to have, but we need to define a different strategy on aging in place, aging in the city. And therefore, it's much more a collaboration question and a funding question than just a operator question or what do we do as a developer. And therefore, it's so important that we discuss it at UKREiiF because it's not a minor asset class. It can be activization of the whole value chain. Because, for example, home ownership is one of the most important topics of the baby boom generation. Because if we can't move that capital from the baby boomers, then actually the whole value chain of resi won't move, and also they won't move into an age-appropriate alternative.
So we talk about capital, bringing Kevin back in as the capital on the stage. Care homes and retirement living are obviously 2 really important methods of providing accommodation for elderly people. But they both, I imagine, have completely different capital requirements. It's a lot of investment to develop a new scheme from scratch. You have the fill-up rates and so forth. As an investor, what are the main differences? How do you think about both? And does one excite you more than the other moving forward?
Yeah, I mean, good question. I think, in a way, look, they both sit under the senior living banner, but they are quite different in many ways, and the proposition therefore kind of reflects that. So care homes, I think, predominantly for us, are forward-funded assets. It's probably a core plus investment, pretty stabilised, working with well-established operators on a triple net lease basis. So we are simply the property, we are the landlord. Our operators have a covenant. And there's a yield that you pin on that at the outset, and that gives you your return. Our OHF fund now is around getting towards 2 billion of gross asset value, over 120 homes, all the care home operators you would imagine. And look, really strong prospects for growth. And when we talk to global capital, they look at the UK as a relatively benign area to invest on a healthcare basis. We don't have super regulation like you do in some parts of the world. In Germany, price regulation on care homes has resulted in a number of operators not being able to run their business, which is a real challenge and generally turns investment off. So it is a benign environment, and you're right, we create care homes or invest in care homes, which are, I think our oldest one is about 2016, so it's all wet rooms, all super modern kit. Nick's right, you probably don't necessarily choose to go and live in a care home, but you choose the best care home you can when that's a requirement. And I think that's pretty much the experience. And I think the way the UK has led what a good care home looks like, can be repeated in other parts of Europe, particularly as, self-pay becomes more the fashion, just simply because the fiscal pressure of the sheer number of older people needing care homes is going to also be a challenge in other European jurisdictions. So we look for stability and deliverability. Typically, a care home costs about 10 or 11 million pounds to deliver. Let's flip over to retirement living for a second. And interestingly, a lot of people forget, and this is good news, guys, not many old people end up in a care home in absolute terms. I mean, you'd be surprised how low that number is. And think about it. Older people get frail. That doesn't mean to say you're going to spend 5 or 10 years of your later life in a care home. That's not how it works out. It might be 9 or 10 months for some people who are unlucky, who have some sorts of illness, and if dementia, probably almost certainly, but it's only a very small portion of the older population. So where does the other 90 or 95% of older people actually go when they're thinking about age-appropriate housing? That's where senior housing comes in. But as an asset class, it looks more like BTR or co-living or other elements in the living sector than it does like a healthcare product. Because at the end of the day, you're developing an estate that's either for sale or for rent. So it creates an income through sale or rent, and it's more likely to be probably a value-add proposition at the moment. So senior living is probably one of the areas that you can genuinely get a value-add return on in the living sectors in the UK at the moment. It's true, it's still relatively nascent. So I look at the States as an investor, and actually the senior living market in the US is kind of the cornerstone of all institutional investment in all living across the globe. It's kind of where it started. That's where the DNA for investors flipping from commercial to resi started. Penetration rates in the US are about 7, and in some places 8 or 9%, and indeed in Florida sometimes more like 15 or 20%. In the UK they're about 1, other parts of Europe well less than 1. The delta between those two positions represents the opportunity. So, that probably translates into, tens of, if not hundreds of thousands of units in the UK and every major jurisdiction in Europe in terms of an opportunity. So it feels like, as an investor, the value-add living class that's got the biggest growth opportunity, but we need to get it right, and you need the right model. To date, a lot of what we've done in the UK has been for sale, but as I think someone from Argent said this morning, 65%, that's the highest number I've heard in terms of inflation from 2020 to now in build costs, yet effectively static housing prices, and that's creating an affordability challenge for the for sale model in the UK. But interestingly, rental doesn't suffer from those same issues because people in the UK tend to have very, very generous pensions compared to the global average. And actually, when we look at it as a data-led exercise, typically 2, 3, 4 times as many people in any given catchment can afford to rent retirement housing as they can to buy without losing the capital in their primary home. That's quite an interesting nugget to understand. When that penny drops, as an investor, you really get that there's a scalable opportunity out there to be delivered by operators and investors in the UK.
Fantastic. I want to get on in a minute to finish the session before we go to questions to talk about how we accelerate growth. But just before we do that, I'd just like to pick up on a point that Phillipa made about sort of health benefits of living in a retirement community. And I think you mentioned bringing in your GP service. That was a pilot, I believe, around nine communities, if I'm right. But I think it will be useful for the audience just to understand what are the true benefits for people living in age-appropriate accommodation in terms of reduced hospital admissions and wellness benefits.
Don't ask me to quote any facts and figures, but there's been studies done which demonstrate that people living within a retirement community utilise less of their NHS. We know, for example, that if somebody does go to hospital, they can get discharged much earlier because we can support them. So there's lots of benefits in that. I think we've already talked about it, but the social element is hugely important to people. We know that living alone is one of the big drivers of health concerns. 4.5 million people live on their own in the UK, so having that whole community is really important. We're looking at things such as audiology services because loss of hearing is one of the key elements for dementia, driving in dementia, and we're learning more and more that dementia is actually preventable in a lot of cases. I don't know if you've seen the recent Lancet it's really clear that they think at least 40 to 50%, and it could be higher. And that goes to that prevention, because they're all linked to the same things about how you eat, the socialization, hearing, all of those things. So I think, being in part of a community that's really focusing on, prevention, we're sort of having those discussions with people. This is why you need to wear your hearing aid, all of those things, and making it less of a stigma, and actually enjoy getting old, have fun, do these things. And the benefits are absolutely there. And I think it's interesting because when you go through planning, people often think, oh no, there's going to be all these old people and they're going to use a lot more services. And it's just not the reality. And I think we have to have those discussions about why these are the benefits. And actually, there's all tenure, aren't there? That, you've got social side, you've got, mid-range, you've got high range. There's something for everybody. And it's just saying, how do we meet the needs of these people in a way that's planned? And it's, that everybody understands that actually the positive impact of having the right housing for people to support them.
Okay. Just to conclude then the panel session, I want to talk about how we accelerate growth. Tenure models has been mentioned, I think, several times. Maybe if we just go to each operator in turn, what are your current tenure models? Nick, maybe could we start with you? And I know you're moving more into the mid-market with your current. Are you changing your tenure models on the back of that?
Yes, it will happen without question. And I think Kevin's absolutely right. Why isn't? I go back again to the examples I gave earlier of Canada and other territories. Those 35,000 units I talked about in Canada are all rental. And yet, home ownership levels in Canada, as in New Zealand, in fact, are very high. And we all think here that, owning your own home has been a fundamental part of the model. And actually, typically, it has been in the UK, because, let's be honest, the older generation have got richer from owning a house than anything else they've ever done. So to wean them off that, I always thought, actually, was going to be quite difficult. I think that's changing. I think it's changing for a variety of reasons, one of which, actually, is that worked because they were obsessed with the principle that you have to be in the housing chain because house price inflation will always pay for any problems. That's disappearing now. We have projects, we've got one in Clapham, where typically someone who's sold a house in Clapham now is probably getting the same or less than they would have got 10 years ago. And when you take inflation out, but add in stamp duty as a cost and the other costs associated with living with us, it doesn't look so attractive. So rental, we are introducing as an alternative, and it's becoming, when you go through a process of discussing it, people are much more accepting of it. And by the way, the baby boomers coming through, this new generation, aren't as wedded to traditional values as like home ownership. So there is a change, and we will definitely see us move, particularly, I would suggest, in our mid-market offer, where I was saying to somebody yesterday, Carl, actually, truthfully, if you said to most buyers at Watford, you can rent or you can buy or you can have shared ownership, they'd just say, I don't really care, I just want to be there. It's very different. Conceptually, it's different. They're far less conservative. They just want it as an option, and once they see it and see the benefits of it. So, yes, we're beginning to and we'll introduce more multi-tenure schemes, and at different price points, as I say, from what we've done, because they're all needed.
Will that accelerate your fill-up of schemes, do you think, going rental?
Kevin said the point about development, and we work together on projects. The sales rates are notoriously difficult and slow, actually, in our sector, and it's because of the lack of knowledge, and we have to work very hard to convince people of what I said earlier, which is this isn't something to be fearful of, and as Phillipa said, it's actually something to look forward to as an enhancement. It's what it does, again, happen in other territories. People will make the positive choice to say, why on earth am I staying in a 4-bedroom house with all the inherent risks, with all of my personal capital tied up in it, and I can't afford to switch the lights on, when I could downsize, release capital, help my kids buy their house, and live a wonderful life with all my friends. But why not do that? That's coming. And it is beginning to break through in terms of sales rates, but it's still hard work. And the biggest reason, in answer to your question, Mike, why isn't there more growth in this country? There isn't more growth because there isn't more growth. The familiarity is not there. There isn't the scale there. nobody in Christchurch, New Zealand, questions moving into a retirement village because everybody's done it, or at least 20% of the older population have. They all know somebody who's done it. And we haven't got there yet, so it's going to take a leap. But I would say it's partly as well because we've chased that premium end, where actually the real secret is in the mid-market, where, as I say, people are more accepting.
Omair, so your business, what type of model? Rental mainly, or sale? How are you thinking going forward?
So kind of our core business with care home operators, but our focus is an alternative approach to dementia care. And to make that work, your staffing levels have to be very, very, very generous. And the funding stream to allow that oxygen to happen is typically through the self-funding market.
Okay. Bupa, Richmond Villages, I think you go to a village, you have options, a menu of the type of tenure that you can take. What's the most popular?
Back to Nick, historically it was purchase and the leasehold, but more and more we're seeing people wanting rental for that very reason that Nick said. I think for me, the thing that will really accelerate the growth is obviously we've got the whole leasehold reform conversations going on, and I think having an alternative and having the retirement occupancy lease would be learning from New Zealand. It means that people can release the capital in their home. One of the biggest questions that we have is when customers come to us is, they worry about can they afford this long term. People always plan as if they're going to live to 100, so they've got to try and work out their money as if they're going to be to 100. So having something where we can increase the deferred management fee so that people can fix their costs now and know that when they die that they can pay for things, through releasing that equity is really important. But the task force said we've got to have a similar language. People have got to understand it and look at the benefits of it. But a lot of people would happily pay more later, but on the basis that they've got that certainty now, they can move in, they know that, they know exactly. And even for the families, there's certainty. I mean, I was talking to a resident recently who said, I picked dependency so that I was independent. He said, I wanted to make the choice myself. I didn't want to leave it to my children, but I wanted to make sure I could afford it. And I think having that sort of conversation about a different tenure of than leasehold, I think is really important.
So Ron, Netherlands, humanitas, I think is how you pronounce it?
Yeah, humanitas. It's a challenging word. Yeah.
I haven't got the accent, I'm afraid. They have intergeneration from a different perspective. They actually provide accommodation, I think, for university students on some of their schemes, heavily subsidised, to essentially aid workforce. People will get heavily subsidised accommodation and then will work in the facilities. Do you have any experience of how that works in practice? Is that something we can bring over here?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. Very straightforward. I'm not very enthusiastic about it because I don't think it is the solution. There's no scalability of that solution. Yeah. So there are more operators with this type of, I would say, social impact solution where somebody has a benefit, let's say a reduction of rent, and then there's a social system. I would suggest to take a look at Swiss, where Swiss has actually a society solution where if you spend a number of hours as a young professional to help an elderly people, then you get some credits for later. I think that's a very interesting system because it creates awareness of your social impact if we help elderly people. And then you can actually use that system later when you are an elderly person. So it's actually a very social system. I think that's actually, and this is a bit of a tricky idea, but I do believe that because of the scale of the issue, that it's not enough to have 20 young professionals in a facility of 150 where there is non-professional care or assistance. It's a nice to have, but it's not a resilient system. And maybe I would like to elaborate on my neighbor, because I think we should be aware that we need to provide actually wealth management to people, and especially on the family level, because there are also powers against a rental model, and it's actually your own family member. Where actually, because who is also making a decision about jumping into a care home? It's not actually the person who is in the care home. No, it's the daughter or the son who makes the decision. And it's also about financial planning, when it's about, okay, how much money do we have going into a rental system and then renting for 5 years, let's say 1,500 euros. Well, that's actually maybe my money. So please be aware of the sensitivity of this topic. That I think that's interesting to add this perspective to the conversation. That and I think take a look at your own planning. We maybe all have a parent where this is maybe just around the corner, and then it's always about financial planning, wealth planning, and that's also a challenging conversation with families.
Excellent. Well, a very insightful discussion. I think we could probably go on for hours. As you say, your summit lasts a whole day. So,
because I was actually quite curious, when you take a closer look at this group of people, how many people are already in this asset class? Maybe can we raise some hands? I don't want to take over, Mike, but I'm very curious. Okay, I would say that's a minority, or it's 50-50?
50-50, I would say, yeah.
And after this, then let's say the 50% who is not yet in the system, do you think, wow, that's an interesting opportunity, or do you see more boundaries not to enter the market? Yeah, maybe again the hand raise. So the people who are not yet in the system, who is actually very enthusiastic after this panel discussion?
Excellent.
Wow, well done, Mike.
There we go. Well, on that note, let's hand it over to the audience now. We've got a bit of time for questions. So please, questions for the panel. There's a roving mic circulating. Who would like to go first?
It's not aimed at anyone in particular. I suspect that Nick might have a view on this, but I live in Leeds. I see schemes like Scarcroft Park, which offer a really incredible blend of different housing types and things like that. Why do you think there aren't more schemes like that being created? Because to my mind, I'm heavily involved in the resi sector, and I look at the stuff that goes up, and a lot of the time it's like, another one of those blocks where a family's going to buy it, it's going to halve in price in a few years' time when they come to sell it. It's so frustrating seeing that cycle happen in this sector, and I think that's what puts a lot of people off it, really.
It absolutely is, and Serena here from Arco will tell you our biggest problem actually is reputational damage from other people who operate in the general world. No, I know who you mean. And that is a problem. Actually, it's a good point, because there's a difference, which is alignment. Anyone who buys at Scarcroft, and Phillipa made the point earlier about higher deferred management charges. One of the reasons it works so well in other territories is because we're all on the same side. We want it to be a success on a continuous basis, so that the resales are as successful as the first sales, because we have value in a commercial interest in those. So we will continue to invest and hopefully maintain those standards. I would say what's needed here, though, one of the things, Kevin and I have got a scheme in North London, Brent Cross Town, with Argent. And it's a brilliant example of actually multi-generational as well, because it's right bang in the middle of 3,500 residential units, a campus for Sheffield University, co-housing, student housing and everything else. And we are right in the heart of it. That's what's really needed here, right here. Because this is where people want to live. They want to live surrounded by a community, and they want to be surrounded by the activities of a community which are stimulating an environment, whether it's the theatre, whether it's the hospitals, whatever it is that they want. And that's part of the problem. Scarcroft, which I hope you'll come and see, is lovely, and it's glorious countryside and it's whatever, but it is its own community, where actually, particularly in the more mid-market, people want to be right in the heart of a community. And actually, just one last thing on growth, and one of the points from the task force, which was discussed earlier, and the biggest motivation, which will really get the attention of all these people who aren't sitting in this room, is when someone like Argent, who was developing, there was no reference, right, 3,500 units within the master plan for that, as for most regen schemes, Canada Water, take your pick in London South East. not one reference to the fact that 20% of the local population were over 65 in that area. What it needs actually is from central government to make a dictum that every major scheme must have a proportion of housing that properly reflects the wider community and the local population. That in itself will mean that we don't have to wait for Berkeley or Barrett or Taylor Wimpey to persuade them that they should move away from their standard, fairly average housing. But actually they must incorporate a proportion that properly reflects it. And then they'll have to come and talk to us.
Excellent. Any other questions? You got one, Richards?
Yeah, I just wanted to add a little bit to what Nick said then. And it's an agenda which I actually used to play with quite a lot about 10 years ago. But I think, is it the second biggest landowner in the UK is who? The NHS. So how many times do you see the NHS redeveloping a disused hospital site? And again, a bit like Nick said, they'll sell the land. They have no interest in what happens on there later on. By selling the land, they get worse value, so they don't get the uplift through the development cycle. And, you know, particularly in a time of stress like we are now, where, you know, build cost inflation has really ripped the seat out of viability of lots of living asset classes. You know, there's a real challenge to the UK. It really impacts, and it goes to your question about why does retirement housing sometimes sell at less than it was originally sold at. Nothing to do with the operator, by the way. Nothing as bad has happened there. It's just simply some realignment. And therefore, you've got to think about how do we tackle those questions at root. Now, one of them is the use of public land. Is the NHS JVing with people, controlling what their 106 is. So the 106 isn't affordable housing. It's healthcare. It's extra care. It's retirement housing, because that creates a benefit to the NHS. It levers the use of its land for a public health good. And then secondly, that point about, you know, let's just be honest here. As a retirement housing sector, whether it's retirement or whether it's IRC, we all stand together, okay? And we have to talk to government on that equal platform. And where there are challenges, we have to be honest and deal with them. And if tenure is a difficulty and we're worried about resale value, although, you know, someone's mum probably lived there for 8 years and no one's talking about the value that was saved and created in those 8 years, but yeah, that's a different point. But if ownership is the wrong way and renting would have eradicated that issue about what do I get at the end, then we all also think about that and have a grown-up conversation and understand that it's not the service, it might be the way that we own it. And think about, I always use the example of motor cars. 15 years ago, you would have bought your E-Class and you would have traded it in and bought another one 4 years later. Now everyone leases their cars, very similar, and people have got together that might be a more efficient way to deal with it. So let's not throw the baby out the bathwater. We've got some great models and great delivery in the UK. People challenge with viability, trying to do the right thing. Let's create the right structures that support it. But let's also get the public sector back involved to support private development for, you know, Mr. and Mrs. average in their retirement in the UK, because I think at a time of stretched viability, that's going to be a really important part of the story.
Excellent. I think time for one final quick question. Has anyone? Gentleman at the back there. Just at the side.
Hello, my name's Mark Seaman. I work for Samsung in the UK, and I'm going to come at this from a slightly different angle and just ask the question from a technology perspective, and I don't particularly mean healthcare, but from a technology perspective, what role do you see technology both playing in the customer experience within the environments you're creating and within the actual infrastructure that you're creating to allow your spaces to be adaptable to the needs of those buildings over the next 5 or 10 years?
Phillipa?
Yeah, so we've been involved with the ISO 25553, which is all about smart, multi-generational neighbourhoods. And it's so important. Like, you know, we know over the next 10 years, technology is going to change at a rate like we've never seen. We need to incorporate that into our builds. We need to understand, you know, how can people age well in their own property, but with the right technology to support them. You know, in an ideal world, you'll be able to sort of know before you've even had an issue, you know, particularly around things like UTIs, where we know that you can identify that way before you end up with an A&E admission. We know if you're over the age of 80 and you have a hospital admission that you're likely to die within the next 2 years. So we need to be really focusing on how do we pick these things up and use technology to really identify these things, and particularly as well about connection. How do we utilise technology to make sure that people are connected where they can't necessarily get out and about? So completely important. We've got to have the conversation now, and we've got to start planning for it, because it will be upon us before we know it, and it's really important that we do it. How you retrospectively do that is the real challenge, because that's where the costs come in. You can plan ahead, but it's the retrospectively side of things that's really difficult.
Yeah, and you need to come and talk to us, because I've had I had conversations with some of your colleagues in the past who all say, yeah, it's interesting, but it's not really big enough, this sector. It's another problem with scale. But you can help us with scale, because it's going to be huge. Everything you've hopefully heard today will tell you that this is the biggest opportunity probably that exists, again, or on this campus, because there's a massive opportunity and a massive demand and need, and technology is fundamental to that in every aspect, diagnostically, in terms of providing support in people's homes to prevent falls and trips and hazards. Everything we said earlier about keeping people out of care homes and out of an A&E department, you can help us with. So by all means, absolutely, and you can do it now. Algorithmically. You know that Mrs. Jones gets up at 2 a.m. every night, and she doesn't that night. Therefore, something's wrong and worth a call. It's huge, and so much of it's there. Actually, most of it's on your Apple Watch or your Garmin watch. If you go for a run and you fall over. Yeah. Sorry about that.
Good plug there.
But if you do, if you're out running and you fall over, my wife knows I've fallen over and where I've fallen over. That's sort of the beginnings of all of this.
So maybe one remark, Mike. I fully agree. I think it's also about the split incentive issue over here. So who pays, who is investing, where is the benefit? So therefore, I think it's a PPS requirement, or PPP you call it in the UK over here. Because it's not, you shouldn't ask it only to a market player, because it's not an asset investor where the investment and the benefit will be. So it's almost on a society level. And I think it also requires maybe one additional thing is long-term policy making. So not the 4 years starner, or then it's after 4 years we go to left, or after 4 years we go to the right. So I would almost say we need a master planning for this, where it's not depending on whether it's Labour or someone else. It requires a long-term perspective on the horizon.
Excellent. Well, I think we're well and truly out of time now, so I'd like to thank everyone for coming on this afternoon. I'd like to thank this fantastic panel. And if you're coming to the Fringe event tour, I think there are a few spare spaces. We'll congregate just outside the door there by the UKREiiF sign, and hopefully we'll navigate our way to the buses that are waiting. So thank you ever so much.